Hi there. My name is Patrick Cain. I am the data guy at Village Media, which is a chain based in Sault Ste. Marie, which is hopefully the future of local journals. God knows we need one. We have a chain of local sites that are the equivalent of local newspapers in Northern Ontario and the 905 and Niagara and Barrie and sort of generally in Ontario. And as of this morning in Toronto. I was part of the launch this morning at Toronto Today, which is a site covering the downtown core and the west end out to Parkside. So it's been busy. It's been a busy day. Anyway, if we're at the future, I'm not sure who is. So I hope we're the future. Something else in the future is cool. But so I'm going to try something potentially very foolish this afternoon, which is to try to say something intelligent about things that can go wrong with data journalism in 15 minutes. There's far more material than that, believe me. But basically for me, these come in three areas. These are just messing up the data, just making procedural errors and handling the data. Just making procedural errors of the data, just screwing something up. We'll get into that in a minute. The second is being given data that is correct from your source, but misunderstanding it. This is easier than it should be. And the third is just simply being given flawed information. So simply messing up the data. There are lots of ways of doing this. There are a lot of creative possibilities. They're all quite treacherous. You can mess up a spatial join between data. You can think that it's joined, but it's not. Your date formats in Excel are something I've yet to master. But if you try to join sets of dates, I speak from experience, and no events happen after the 12th of any month, it's fairly obvious what's happened. Curly and straight quotes, French accents. I missed Google Fusion tables a great deal. I found it very useful, but it simply could not tolerate French accents. It's not the fault of the French accents, it's the fault of their limitations. So a piece of excellent advice I was given, and I've tried to follow it, is you can't totally prevent this kind of thing, but what you can do is always when you get a data set aside a copy of the original data and don't do anything to it. Keep it perfect, keep it pushed away somewhere, write protected if you have to, keep it somewhere safe. Because when you take some weird path with your data and meet these guys, and it's much more fun for them than it is for you because you're a deadline and they're not, then you have something to just track back. And it's like, I screwed this up. It's probably not worth my time to try to reason through how it got screwed up. I just go back to the perfect original and start over. It's just easier. I had two examples of the second kind. I think I might skip over. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I like to think of meeting a database as very much like interviewing a person. You sit down, you interview the data. And just like in an interview, you start with a plan, but then interesting things happen you haven't thought of. And there are interesting possibilities you haven't thought of. But also, because there are flaws in a data set, just like there isn't any other information source, interview it critically. It's like, don't take everything for granted. It can be treacherous because you can be given a nice, clean spreadsheet. It looks so perfect. It looks so technocratic. And it's a human product. It has blind spots. It has things it's missing. So I'm going to, just for time limitation, I actually designed this for a training session we're doing in the Sioux in November. So I'm just going to skip over the hanging judgment, which is a pity because he's kind of fun. He doesn't exist, by the way. The short story, Rob, is I was trying to imitate the jail inmate postal code for the story for the Star for Nova Scotia, and there was a reason it didn't work. So there's a very high quality income data set which you can get from StatsCan. And on the back end, it takes every tax filer's tax return and plugs it into census data. And so what you get from this is the quality and integrity of the information is plugged into the tax system, which may have its limitations, but is going to be better than what just people arbitrarily put in their census forms for their data. It should potentially be a very high quality data set. So I got this for Toronto when I worked at Global, and you test data by looking at the extremes. This is a problem you often see at the extremes. So I looked at the high income census tracts, and it all kind of made sense. Lawrence Park, it's the Bridle Path. It's like kind of where you'd expect the high incomes to be. So I thought, okay, fine. And looked at the low incomes. The low incomes I could not make it make sense. Eventually it turned out that the problem with using this as a source about income and why you were kind of better off kind of using the census is that the income tax system doesn't really concern itself with people below a certain income level. Basically, you're looking at the upper 80% or so of the population in terms of income. It's not a great tool for tracking poverty. So there were like known low income areas in Toronto and they were not popping up at all. But what puzzled us was the very lowest income tract in Toronto was right at Yonge and Sheppard. And we sort of tried to make this make sense, and it just was not making sense. And eventually, we just got back to StatsCan and say, we're giving up trying to make this make sense. And they sort of thought about it for a day or two, and they said, oh, yeah, there's a charity that's based there that does tax returns for low-income people. It's a nonprofit. And it gets filed from their office. And it's like, oh, well, that makes sense, but what do we do? So it turns out that on the back end, they can tell whether the tax filer's address is different from where the tax was filed from. And we ended up dropping something like 5 census tracts in the entire country, but it made our data make much more sense. But it was a very high quality data set, but there was a stealth problem. It had limitations that you kind of have to reason through. Here, I just explained this. So the data may seem to make sense on the surface. It may seem to be obvious what it is, but keep your critical filters on as you interview it, because there may be pitfalls. There may be sort of limitations to it that aren't immediately obvious. Very few data sets we're working with were actually designed for the purpose that we're using them for, if that makes any sense. Now, the third thing that can go wrong is that the agency that gave you the data just screwed up. This is always a possibility. So I'm working on a story, a very difficult story for the Northern Ontario part of the Village chain that has to do with deaths of teenagers in Northern Ontario, which is radically higher than the rest of the province. They're doing the human reporting. I'm doing the data. My data source is the Ontario Registrar General, which has basically a very, very useful data set of all of the death and marriage and birth certificates in the province going way back. So if you say, I want a number of people died who lived in these postal codes between this state and this state, whose ages were between this and that, the only reason you won't get it is that if they think it will violate personal privacy. And they're pretty, in my experience, pretty reasonable. So basically my approach to this was to say, I want 10 years worth of data where the decedent is between 13 and 19 years old, broken down by the first 3 digits of their postal code. And they churned for a while and they gave me this data set. And so what are our hotspots? For the whole province. These are our hotspots for the whole province. I mean, to start with, this postal code is hardly residential at all. Like you might find a couple of teenagers living in it, and anything you might not. Who knows Hamilton well enough to suggest what the answer could be here? So we had downtown Ottawa. So it finally dawned on us what the problem was, is that that's lots of hospitals here, lots of hospitals where CHEO is in downtown Ottawa. These are where the hospitals are in London, and here is in Hamilton is McMaster, St. Joseph's, and Hamilton General. So we went to the Registrar General. by any chance, did you screw up the decedent's place of residence with the place of death? And they said it's churned for a couple of days. Actually, you got us. You did. Here's a replacement data set, and the replacement made way more sense. So I mean, I screw up. Agencies screw up. Nearly always, people are just doing their best. You can do worse than just apply critical filters and ask questions. I found almost always, unless there's a bit of an adversarial relationship, the agencies you get data from are just people doing their best with their working lives and are willing to answer and willing to adjust if you have critical questions. Which brings us to another thing, which is that, and it surprises me as a data journalist because I'm curious. I get to sort of indulge my curiosity. It's a privilege. That big government agencies don't work with their own data. They don't play with their own data. They don't explore it. They're sitting on storehouses of data. I mean, I was amazed. I did a story for Global a couple of years ago about the old Ontario Drive Clean program, basing it on their data, saying we need to discuss the fact that for nearly all common makes and models of cars, the pass rate is far over 99%. They later canceled the program under a different government, but and they didn't expect the question at all. They weren't aware of that, which just like really is a crucial aspect of your program that essentially everybody passes. So eventually someone says, is there a point to doing this anymore? Like every motorist had to pay $35. You had to take half a day. You had to take your car to the garage. You couldn't re-register your car unless it was done. And I was expecting a whole like comms effort on the other side, and there really wasn't. They were flailing. That's what I have, unless you want to go back to the hanging judge. Go ahead. Okay, we're not the hanging judge. Hanging judge it is. And I'm glad Rob is here because this is he may want to think about this a bit. So this is the hanging judge of Amherst, Nova Scotia, who we now have no reason to believe actually exists in the real world. But why do we think the hanging judge of Amherst existed? So I would have a job at Global as an online reporter years ago, actually very near here, oddly, where we could do data projects really for any local station in the network, which is to say anywhere in the country except for Newfoundland and PEI, and pitch them. And they didn't have their own data resources internally. They were just grateful to be offered stuff. So, Rob, this will look familiar. I thought, what other provinces can we do this for? So I had FOIs going out of the country. I had one in BC, I had one in Alberta, I had one in Manitoba. Actually, it would have been really good story to do in Manitoba. And I thought I'd hit it in Nova Scotia. And this is where my old legacy Google Maps at Global are all broken, which is why this looks like a little sketchy, but I'll have to ask you to overlook that. The whole area around Amherst, around the New Brunswick border, lit up for incarceration, just like strongly lit up for incarceration. I thought, well, like I didn't think of that. I know the area a little bit, not well, but I thought, can we make this make sense? Because there's a certain amount of information on regional crime in Nova Scotia. There's some in Yarmouth. There's quite a bit in Halifax. There's like, but I couldn't make out incarceration in the sort of west of the province. So this is where we get the idea of the hanging judge in Amherst, of just like sending everyone to jail, just been there since the 18th century. But here's the thing, like, I didn't have a number in my head, like how many people are provincially incarcerated in Nova Scotia? Like, I don't know, don't ask me offhand, I'm not sure. Turns out to be about 2,000 or so, give or take. And there were 1,100 people on our spreadsheet. And the 1,100 didn't bother me exactly. I didn't know what the number was supposed to be. But right in the corner, there was a little number without any context, in the region of about 2,000 people. So eventually I just asked the Nova Scotia Justice Minister, like, what is that number? What does it mean? I don't get any context for it. I said, oh, that's the total That's the total number of people. Like when you're admitted to a jail in Nova Scotia, you're given a form to fill out, which has your address and your next of kin and so on it. But they don't need the inmates' home addresses for anything. As I said, we don't send them mail after they're released. So as the inmate chooses not, they don't have a fixed address. They don't choose to say their address. They don't interested in their postal code. Well, it just doesn't get it up in the database. So the data was, as it turned out, in a stealthy way too low quality to work with. Like I can't, like as best we could make out, there's a jail on the west side of the province. There's some clerk somewhere that cares about postal codes. And that's the whole story, which is to say, not really a story. So in other words, like there may be the incarceration map of Nova Scotia story waiting there to be done, but that's, and there may be a data source out there to do it from, but this was not it. But if we hadn't questioned what is this stray number and what does it mean with no label or context, we might well have gone for it. I mean, the next step would be to call the defense lawyers in that part of the province and ask about the local judiciary and so on. So we got in the hanging judge. I think that's everything I have with their questions.